The second important propaganda effort of the Milner Group in the period after 1909 was the Round Table. This was part of an effort by the circle of the Milner Group to accomplish for the whole empire what they had just done for South Africa. The leaders were Philip Carroll in London, as secretary of the London Group, and Lionel Curtis throughout the world, as organizing secretary for the whole movement, but most of the members of the kindergarten cooperated in the project. The plan of procedure was the same as that which had worked so successfully in South Africa, that is, to form local groups of influential men to agitate for imperial federation and to keep in touch with these groups by correspondence and by the circulation of a periodical. As in South Africa, the original cost of the periodical was paid by Abe Bailey. This journal, issued quarterly, was called the Round Table, and the same name was applied to the local groups. Of these local groups, the most important by far was the one in London. In this, Carroll and Brand were the chief figures. The other local groups, also called Round Tables, were set up by Lionel Curtis and others in South Africa, in Canada, in New Zealand, in Australia, and, in a rather rudimentary fashion and somewhat later, in India. The reasons for doing this were described by Curtis himself in 1917 in a letter to the people of India, as follows. We feared that South Africa might abstain from a future war with Germany, on the grounds that they had not participated in the decision to make war. Confronted by this dilemma at the very moment of attaining dominion self-government, we thought it would be wise to ask people in the oldest and most experienced of all dominions what they thought of the matter. So in 1909, Mr. Kerr and I went to Canada and persuaded Mr. Maris, who was then on leave, to accompany us. On this trip the three young men covered a good portion of the Dominion. One day, during a walk through the forests on the Pacific slopes of the Canadian Rockies, Maris convinced Curtis that self-government, however far distant, was the only intelligible goal of British policy in India. The existence of political unrest in India, far from being a reason for pessimism, was the surest sign that the British, with all their manifest failings, had not shirked their primary duty of extending Western education to India and so preparing Indians to govern themselves. I have since looked back on this walk, wrote Curtis, as one of the milestones of my own education. So far I had thought of self-government as a Western institution, which was and would always remain peculiar to the peoples of Europe. It was from that moment that I first began to think of the government of each by each and of all by all not merely as a principle of Western life, but rather of all human life, as the goal to which all human societies must tend. It was from that moment that I began to think of the British Commonwealth as the greatest instrument ever devised for enabling that principle to be realized, not merely for the children of Europe, but for all races and kindreds and peoples and tongues. And it is for that reason that I have ceased to speak of the British Empire and called the book in which I published my views The Commonwealth of Nations. Because of Curtis's position and future influence, this walk in Canada was important not only in his personal life but also in the future history of the British Empire. It needs only to be pointed out that India received complete self-government in 1947 and the British Commonwealth changed its name officially to Commonwealth of Nations in 1948. There can be no doubt that both of these events resulted in no small degree from the influence of Lionel Curtis and the Milner Group, in which he was a major figure. Curtis and his friends stayed in Canada for 4 months. Then Curtis returned to South Africa for the closing session of the Transvaal Legislative Council, of which he was a member. He there drafted a memorandum on the whole question of imperial relations, and, on the day that the Union of South Africa came into existence, he sailed to New Zealand to set up study groups to examine the question. These groups became the Round Table Groups of New Zealand. The memorandum was printed with blank sheets for written comments opposite the text. Each student was to note his criticisms on these blank pages. Then they were to meet in their study groups to discuss these comments, in the hope of being able to draw up joint reports, or at least majority and minority reports, on their conclusions. These reports were to be sent to Curtis, who was to compile a comprehensive report on the whole imperial problem. This comprehensive report would then be submitted to the groups in the same fashion and the resulting comments used as a basis for a final report. 5 study groups of this type were set up in New Zealand, and then 5 more in Australia. The decision was made to do the same thing in Canada and in England, and this was done by Curtis, Carroll, and apparently Dove during 1910. On the trip to Canada, the missionaries carried with them a letter from Milner to his old friend Arthur J. Glazebrook, with whom he had remained in close contact throughout the years since Glazebrook went to Canada for an English bank in 1893. The Round Table in 1941, writing of Glazebrook, said, his great political hero was his friend Lord Milner, with whom he kept up a regular correspondence. As a result of this letter from Milner, Glazebrook undertook the task of founding Round Table groups in Canada and did this so well that he was for 20 years or more the real head of the network of Milner Group units in the Dominion. He regularly wrote the Canadian articles in the Round Table magazine. When he died, in 1940, the Round Table obituary spoke of him as one of the most devoted and loyal friends that the Round Table has ever known. Indeed, he could fairly claim to be one of its founding fathers. In the 1930s he relinquished his central position in the Canadian branch of the Milner Group to Vincent Massey, son-in-law of George Parkin. Glazebrook's admiration for Parkin was so great that he named his son George Parkin D. Twinbrooks Glazebrook. For at the present time Vincent Massey and G.P.D.T. Glazebrook are apparently the heads of the Milner Group organization in Canada, having inherited the position from the latter's father. Both are graduates of Balliol, Massey in 1913 and Glazebrook in 1924. Massey, a member of a very wealthy Canadian family, was lecturer in modern history at Toronto University in 1913 to 1915, and then served, during the war effort, as a staff officer in Canada, as Associate Secretary of the Canadian Cabinet's War Committee, and as Secretary and Director of the Government Repatriation Committee. Later he was Minister without portfolio in the Canadian Cabinet 1924, a member of the Canadian delegation to the Imperial Conference of 1926, and first Canadian Minister to the United States 1926 to 1930. He was President of the National Liberal Federation of Canada in 1932 to 1935, Canadian High Commissioner in London in 1935 to 1946, and Canadian Delegate to the Assembly of the League of Nations in 1936. He has been for a long time Governor of the University of Toronto and of Upper Canada College Parkin's Old School. He remains to this day one of the strongest supporters of Oxford University and of a policy of close Canadian cooperation with the United Kingdom. G.P.D.T. Glazebrook, son of Meltner's old friend Arthur J. Glazebrook and namesake of Meltner's closest collaborator in the Rhodes Trust, was born in 1900 and studied at Upper Canada College, the University of Toronto, and Balliol. Since 1924 he has been teaching history at Toronto University, but since 1942 has been on leave to the Dominion government, engaged in strategic intelligence work with the Department of External Affairs. Since 1948 he has been on loan from the Department of External Affairs to the Department of Defense, where he is acting as head of the new Joint Services Intelligence. This highly secret agency appears to be the Canadian equivalent to the American Central Intelligence Agency. Glazebrook has written a number of historical works, including A History of Transportation in Canada 1938, Canadian External Affairs, The Historical Study to 1914-1942, and Canada at the Peace Conference 1942. It was, as we have said, George Parkin Glazebrook's father who, acting in cooperation with Curtis, Carroll, and Madras and on instructions from Meltner, set up the Round Table Organization in Canada in 1911. About a dozen units were established in various cities. It was during the effort to extend the Round Table Organization to Australia that Curtis first met Lord Chelmsford. He was later Viceroy of India in 1916 to 1921, and there can be little doubt that the Meltner Group was influential in this appointment, for Curtis discussed the plans which eventually became the Government of India Act of 1919 with him before he went to India and consulted with him in India on the same subject in 1916.5. From 1911 to 1913, Curtis remained in England, devoting himself to the reports coming in from the Round Table groups on imperial organization, while Kerr devoted himself to the publication of the Round Table itself. This was an extraordinary magazine. The first issue appeared with the date November 15, 1910. It had no names in the whole issue, either of the officers or of the contributors of the 5 articles. The opening statement of policy was unsigned, and the only address to which communications could be sent was the Secretary, 175 Piccadilly, London. This anonymity has been maintained ever since, and has been defended by the journal itself in advertisements, on the grounds that anonymity gives the contributors greater independence and freedom. The real reasons, however, were much more practical than this, and included the fact that the writers were virtually unknown and were so few in numbers, at first at least, as to make the project appear ridiculous had the articles been signed. For example, Philip Kerr, during his editorship, always wrote the leading article in every issue. In later years the anonymity was necessary because of the political prominence of some of the contributors. In general, the policy of the journal has been such that it has continued to conceal the identity of its writers until their deaths. Even then, they have never been connected with any specific article, except in the case of one article, the first one in the first issue by Lord Lothian. This article was reprinted in the Round Table after the author's death in 1940. The Round Table was essentially the propaganda vehicle of a handful of people and could not have carried signed articles either originally, when they were too few, or later, when they were too famous. It was never intended to be either a popular magazine or self-supporting, but rather was aimed at influencing those in a position to influence public opinion. As Curtis wrote in 1920, a large quarterly like the Round Table is not intended so much for the average reader, as for those who write for the average reader. It is meant to be a storehouse of information of all kinds upon which publicists can draw. Its articles must be taken on their merits and as representing nothing beyond the minds and information of the individual writer of each. 6. It is perhaps worth mentioning that the first article of the first issue, called Anglo-German Rivalry, was very anti-German and forms an interesting bit of evidence when taken in connection with Curtis's statement that the problem of the empire was raised in 1909 by the problem of what role South Africa would play in a future war with Germany. The group, in the period before 1914, were clearly anti-German. This must be emphasized because of the mistaken idea which circulated after 1930 that the Clyden Group, especially men like Lord Lothian, were pro-German. They weren't neither anti-German in 1910 nor pro-German in 1938, but pro-empire all the time, changing their attitudes on other problems as these problems affected the empire. And it should be realized that their love for the empire was not mere jingoism or flag-waving things at which Kerr mocked within the Group 7, but was based on the sincere belief that freedom, civilization, and human decency could best be advanced through the instrumentality of the British Empire. In view of the specific and practical purpose of the Round Table, to federate the empire in order to ensure that the Dominions would join with the United Kingdom in a future war with Germany, the paper could not help being a propagandist organ. Propagandist on a high level, it is true, but nonetheless a journal of opinion rather than a journal of information. Every general article in the paper excluding the reports from representatives in the Dominions was really an editorial, an unsigned editorial speaking for the group as a whole. By the 1920s these articles were declaring, in true editorial style, that the Round Table does not approve of something or other, or, it seems to the Round Table that something else. Later the members of the group denied that the group were concerned with the propagation of any single point of view. Instead, they insisted that the purpose of the group was to bring together persons of various points of view for purposes of self-education. This is not quite accurate. The group did not contain persons of various points of view but rather persons of unusual unanimity of opinion, especially in regard to goals. There was a somewhat greater divergence in regard to methods, and the circulating of memoranda within the group to evoke various comments was for the purpose of reaching some agreement on methods only, the goals being already given. In this, meetings of the group were rather like the meetings of the British Cabinet, although any normal cabinet would contain a greater variety of opinion than did the usual meetings of the group. In general, an expression of opinion by any one member of the group sounded like an echo of any of the others. Their systems of values were identical. The position of the British Commonwealth at the apex of that system was almost axiomatic. The important role played by moral and ideological influences in the Commonwealth and in the value system was accepted by all. The necessity of strengthening the bonds of the Commonwealth in view of the approaching crisis of the civilization of the West was accepted by all. So also was the need for closer union with the United States. There was considerable divergence of opinion regarding the practicality of imperial federation in the immediate future. There was some divergence of ideas regarding the rate at which self-government should be extended to the various parts of the empire, especially India. There was a slight difference of emphasis on the importance of relations between the Commonwealth and the United States. But none of these differences of opinion was fundamental or important. The most basic divergence within the group during the first 20 years or so was to be found in the field of economic ideas, a field in which the group as a whole was extremely weak, and also extremely conservative. This divergence existed, however, solely because of the extremely unorthodox character of Lord Milner's ideas. Milner's ideas as expressed, for example, in his book Questions of the Hour, published in 1923, would have been progressive, even unorthodox, in 1935. They were naturally ahead of the times in 1923, and they were certainly far ahead of the ideas of the group as a whole, for its economic ideas would have been old-fashioned in 1905. These ideas of the group until 1931, at least, were those of late 19th century international banking and financial capitalism. The key to all economics and prosperity was considered to rest in banking and finance. With sound money, a balanced budget, and the international gold standard, it was expected that prosperity and rising standards of living would follow automatically. These ideas were propagated through the Round Table, in the period after 1912, in a series of articles written by Brand and subsequently republished under his name, with the title War and National Finance 1921. They are directly antithetical to the ideas of Milner as revealed in his book published 2 years later. Milner insisted that financial questions must be subordinated to economic questions and economic questions to political questions. As a result, if a deflationary policy, initiated for financial reasons, has deleterious economic or political effects, it must be abandoned. Milner regarded the financial policy advocated by Brand in 1919 and followed by the British government for the next 12 years as a disaster, since it led to unemployment, depression, and ruination of the export trade. Instead, Milner wanted to isolate the British economy from the world economy by tariffs and other barriers and encourage the economic development of the United Kingdom by a system of government spending, self-regulated capital and labour, social welfare, etc. This program, which was based on monopoly capitalism or even National Socialism rather than financial capitalism, as Brand's was embraced by most of the Milner Group after September 1931, when the ending of the gold standard in Britain proved once and for all that Brand's financial program of 1919 was a complete disaster and quite unworkable. As a result, in the years after 1931 the businessmen of the Milner Group embarked on a policy of government encouragement of self-regulated monopoly capitalism. This was relatively easy for many members of the group because of the distrust of economic individualism which they had inherited from Toynbee and Milner. In April 1932, when P. Horsfall, manager of Lazard Brothers Bank, a colleague of Brand, asked John Dove to write the defense of individualism in the Round Table, Dove suggested that he write it himself, but, in reporting the incident to Brand, he clearly indicated that the group regarded individualism as obsolete. 8. This difference of opinion between Milner and Brand on economic questions is not of great importance. The important matter is that Brand's opinion prevailed within the group from 1919 to 1931, while Milner's has grown in importance from 1931 to the present. The importance of this can be seen in the fact that the financial and economic policy followed by the British government from 1919 to 1945 runs exactly parallel to the policy of the Milner Group. This is no accident but is a result, as we shall see, of the dominant position held by the Milner Group in the councils of the Conservative Unionist Party since the First World War. During the first decade or so of its existence, the Round Table continued to be edited and written by the inner circle of the Milner Group, chiefly by Lothian, Brand, Hitchens, Grigg, Dawson, Fisher, and Duff. Curtis was too busy with the other activities of the group to devote much time to the magazine and had little to do with it until after the war. By that time a number of others had been added to the group, chiefly as writers of occasional articles. Most of these were members or future members of All Souls. They include Copeland, Zimmern, Arnold Toynbee, Arthur Salter, Sir Maurice Hankey, and others. The same group that originally started the project in 1910 still controls it today, with the normal changes caused by death or old age. The vacancies resulting from these causes have been filled by new recruits from All Souls. It would appear that Copeland and Brand are the most influential figures today. The following list gives the editors of the Round Table from 1910 to the recent past. Philip Kerr, 1910 to 1917, assisted by E. Grigg, 1913 to 1915. Reginald Copeland, 1917 to 1919. Lionel Curtis, 1919 to 1921. John Duff, 1921 to 1934. Henry B. Hodgson, 1934 to 1939. Vincent Todd Harlow, acting editor, 1938. Reginald Copeland, 1939 to 1941. Geoffrey Dawson, 1941 to 1944. These names, all but two, are already familiar. H. V. Hodgson, the recent recruit to the Milner Group, was taken from All Souls. Born in 1906, he was at Balliol for 3 years, 1925 to 1928, and on graduation obtained a fellowship to All Souls, which he held for the regular term 1928 to 1935. This fellowship opened to him the opportunities which he had the ability to exploit. On the staff of the Economic Advisory Council from 1930 to 1931 and an important member of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, he was assistant editor of the Round Table for 3 years, 1931 to 1934, and became editor when Dove died in 1934. At the same time he wrote for Toynbee the economic sections of the Survey of International Affairs from 1929 on, publishing these in modified form as a separate volume, with the title Slum and Recovery, 1929 to 1937. In 1938, with the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, he left the Round Table editorship and went to the Ministry of Information, which was controlled completely by the Milner Group, as director of the Empire Division. After 2 years in this post, he was given the more critical position of Reforms Commissioner in the Government of India for 2 years, 1941 to 1942, and then was made Assistant Secretary and later head of the Non-Munitions Division of the Ministry of Production. This position was held until the war ended, 3 years later. He then returned to private life as assistant editor of the Sunday Times. In addition to the writings already mentioned, he published The Economics of a Changing World 1933 and The Empire in the World 1937, and edited The British Commonwealth and the Future 1939. Vincent T. Harlow, born in 1898, was in the Royal Field Artillery in 1917 to 1919 and then went to Brasenose, where he took his degree in 1923. He was lecturer in modern history at University College, Southampton, in 1923 to 1927. And then came into the magic circle of the Milner Group. He was keeper of Rhodes House Library in 1928 to 1938, Bite lecturer in Imperial History in 1930 to 1935, and has been Rhodes Professor of Imperial History at the University of London since 1938. He was a member of the Imperial Committee of the Royal Institute of International Affairs and, during the war, was head of the Empire Information Service at the Ministry of Information. He lives near Oxford, apparently in order to keep in contact with the group. In the decade 1910 to 1920, the inner circle of the Miltner Group was busy with two other important activities in addition to the Round Table magazine. These were studies of the problem of imperial federation and of the problem of extending self-government to India. Both of these were in charge of Lionel Curtis and continued with little interruption from the war itself. The Round Table, which was in charge of Carroll, never interrupted its publication, but from 1915 onward it became a secondary issue to winning the war and making the peace. The problem of imperial federation will be discussed here and in Chapter 8, the war and the peace in Chapter 7, and the problem of India in Chapter 10. During the period 1911 to 1913, as we have said, Curtis was busy in England with the reports from the Round Table groups in the Dominions in reply to his printed memorandum. At the end of 191 and again in 1913, he printed these reports in two substantial volumes, without the names of the contributors. These volumes were never published, but 1,000 copies of each were distributed to the various groups. On the basis of these reports, Curtis drafted a joint report, which was printed and circulated as each section was completed. It soon became clear that there was no real agreement within the groups and that imperial federation was not popular in the Dominions. This was a bitter pill to the group, especially to Curtis, but he continued to work for several years more. In 1912, Miltner and Kerr went to Canada and made speeches to Round Table groups and their associates. The following year Curtis went to Canada to discuss the status of the inquiry on imperial organization with the various Round Table groups there and summed up the results in a speech in Toronto in October 1913. He decided to draw up for reports as follows. A. The existing situation. B. A system involving complete independence for the Dominions. C. A plan to secure unity of foreign relations by each Dominions following a policy independent from but parallel to that of Britain itself. D. A plan to reduce the United Kingdom to a Dominion and create a new imperial government. Overall, the Dominions. Since the last was what Curtis wanted, he decided to write that report himself and allow supporters of each of the other three to write theirs. 1,000 copies of this speech were circulated among the groups throughout the world. When the war broke out in 1914, the reports were not finished, so it was decided to print the 4 sections already sent out, with a concluding chapter. 1,000 copies of this, with the title Project of a Commonwealth, were distributed among the groups. Then a popular volume on the subject, with the title The Problem of the Commonwealth and Curtis's name as editor, was published May 1916. 2 months later, the earlier work project was published under the title The Commonwealth of Nations, again with Curtis named as editor. Thus appeared for the first time in public the name which the British Empire was to assume 32 years later. In the September 1916 issue of the Round Table, Carroll published a statement on the relationship of the two published volumes to the Round Table groups. Because of the paper shortage in England, Curtis in 1916 went to Canada and Australia to arrange for the separate publication of the problem of the Commonwealth in those countries. At the same time he set up new round table groups in Australia and New Zealand. Then he went to India to begin serious work on Indian reform. From this emerged the Government of India Act of 1919, as we shall see later. By this time Curtis and the others had come to realize that any formal federation of the empire was impossible. As Curtis wrote in 1917 in his letter to the people of India, the people of the Dominions rightly aspire to control their own foreign affairs and yet retain their status as British citizens. On the other hand, they detest the idea of paying taxes to any imperial parliament, even to one upon which their own representatives sit. The inquiry convinced me that, unless they sent members and pay taxes to an imperial parliament, they could not control their foreign affairs and also remain British subjects. But I do not think that doctrine is more distasteful to them than the idea of having anything to do with the Government of India. Reluctantly Curtis and the others postponed the idea of a federated empire and fell back on the idea of trying to hold the empire together by the intangible bonds of common culture and common outlook. This had originally in Rhodes and Milner been a supplement to the project of a federation. It now became the chief issue, and the idea of federation fell into a secondary place. At the same time, the idea of federation was swallowed up in a larger scheme for organizing the whole world within a League of Nations. This idea had also been held by Rhodes and Milner, but in quite a different form. To the older men, the world was to be united around the British Empire as a nucleus. To Curtis, the empire was to be absorbed into a world organization. This second idea was fundamentally mystical. Curtis believed, "Die and ye shall be born again." He sincerely felt that if the British Empire died in the proper way by spreading liberty, brotherhood, and justice, it would be born again in the higher level of existence, as a world community, or, as he called it, a Commonwealth of Nations. It is not yet clear whether the resurrection envisaged by Curtis and his associates will occur, or whether they merely assisted at the crucifixion of the British Empire. The conduct of the new India in the next few decades will decide this question. The idea for federation of the empire was not original with the Round Table Group, although their writings would indicate that they sometimes thought so. The federation which they envisaged had been worked out in detail by persons close to the Cecil bloc and was accepted by Milner and Rhodes as their own chief goal in life. The original impetus for imperial federation arose within the Liberal Party as a reaction against the Little England doctrines that were triumphant in England before 1868. The original movement came from men like John Stuart Mill, whose arguments in support of the Empire are just like Curtis's, and Earl Grey, who was colonial secretary under Russell in 1846–1852. This movement resulted in the founding of the Royal Colonial Society, now Royal Empire Society, in 1868, and, as a kind of subsidiary of this, the Imperial Federation League in 1884. Many Unionist members of the Cecil bloc, such as Brassey and Goshen, were in these organizations. In 1875, F. P. Labilliere, the moving power in both organizations, read a paper before the older one on the permanent unity of the empire and suggested a solution of the imperial problem by creating a superimposed imperial legislative body and a central executive over the whole empire, including the United Kingdom. 7 years later, in the political organization of the empire, he divided authority between this new federal authority and the dominions by dividing the business of government into imperial questions, local questions, and questions concerning both levels. He then enumerated the matters that would be allotted to each division, on a basis very similar to that later advocated by Curtis. Another speaker, George Burineau, in 1880, dealt with the natural development of Canada in a fashion that sounds exactly like Curtis. These ideas and projects were embraced by Milner as his chief purpose in life until, like Curtis, he came to realize their impracticality. 12 Milner's ideas can be found in his speeches and letters, especially in 2 letters of 1901 to Brassey and Parkin. Brassey had started a campaign for imperial federation accompanied by devolution, that is, granting local issues to local bodies even within the United Kingdom, and the creation of an imperial parliament to include representatives of the colonies. This imperial parliament would deal with imperial questions, while local parliaments would deal with local questions. In pursuit of this project, Brassey published a pamphlet, in December 1900, called A Policy on Which All Liberals May Unite, and sent to Milner an invitation to join him. Milner accepted in February 1901, saying, "There are probably no 2 men who are more fully agreed in their general view of imperial policy than we. It is clear to me that we require separate organs to deal with local home business and with imperial business. The attempt to conduct both through one so-called imperial parliament is breaking down. Granted that we must have separate parliaments for imperial and local business, I have been coming by a different road, and for somewhat different reasons, to the conclusion which you also are heading for, this, that it would be better not to create a new body over the so-called imperial parliament, but to create new bodies, or a new body under it for the local business of Great Britain and Ireland, leaving it to deal with the wider questions of foreign policy, the defense of the empire, and the relations of the several parts. In that case, of course, the colonies would have to be represented in the imperial parliament, which would thus become really imperial. One great difficulty, no doubt, is that, if this body were to be really effective as an instrument of imperial policy, it would require to be reduced in numbers. The reduction in numbers of British members might no doubt be facilitated by the creation of local legislatures. The time is ripe to make the beginning. I wish Rosebery, who could carry through such a policy if any man could, was less pessimistic. The idea of devolving the local business of the Imperial Parliament upon local legislative bodies for Scotland, England, Wales, and Ireland was advocated in a book by Lord Esher called After the War and in a book called The Great Opportunity by Edward Wood, the future Lord Halifax. These books, in their main theme, were nothing more than a restatement of this aspect of the Imperial Federation project. They were accompanied, on June 4, 1919, by a motion introduced in the House of Commons by Wood, and carried by a vote of 187 to 34, that the time has come for the creation of subordinate legislatures within the United Kingdom. Nothing came of this motion, just as nothing came of the Federation plans. Milner's ideas on the latter subject were restated in a letter to Parkin on September 18, 1901. The existing parliaments, whether British or colonial, are too small, and so are the statesmen they produce except in accidental cases like Chamberlain for such big issues. Until we get a real imperial council, not merely a consultative, but first a constitutional, and then an executive council with control of all our world business, we shall get nothing. Look at the way in which the splendid opportunities for federal defense which this war afforded, have been thrown away. I believe it will come about, but at present I do not see the man to do it. Both you and I could help him enormously, almost decisively indeed, for I have, and doubtless you have, an amount of illustration and argument to bring to bear on the subject, drawn from practical experience, which would logically smash the opposition. Our difficulty in the old days was that we were advocating a grand, but, as it seemed, an impractical idea. I should advocate the same thing today as an urgent practical necessity. 13. The failure of imperial federation in the period 1910 to 1917 forced Parkin and Milner to fall back on ideological unity as achieved through the Rhodes Scholarships, just as the same event forced Curtis and others to fall back on the same goal as achieved through the Royal Institute of International Affairs. All parties did this with reluctance. As Stubbs wrote to Brand in 1923, "This later thing, the RIIA, is all right. It may help us to reach that unity of direction and foreign policy we are looking for, if it becomes a haunt of visitors from the Dominions. But Lionel's first love has still to be won, and if, as often happens, accomplishment lessens appetite, and he turns again to his earlier and greater work, we shall all be the gainers." 14. This shift from institutional to ideological bonds for uniting the empire makes it necessary that we should have a clear idea of the outlook of the Round Table and the whole Milner Group. This outlook was well stated in an article in Volume II of that journal, from the pen of an unidentified writer. This article, entitled "The Ethics of Empire," is deserving of close attention. It emphasized that the arguments for the empire and the bonds which bind it together must be moral and not based on considerations of material advantage or even of defense. This emphasis on moral considerations, rather than economic or strategic, is typical of the group as a whole and is found in Milner and even in Rhodes. Professional politicians, bureaucrats, utilitarians, and materialist social reformers are criticized for their failure to appeal convincingly as an ideal of moral welfare to the ardor and imagination of a democratic people. They are also criticized for failure to see that this is the basis on which the empire was reared. The development of the British Empire teaches how moral conviction and devotion to duty have inspired the building of the structure. Opponents of imperialism are wont to suggest that the story will not bear inspection, that it is largely the record of self-aggrandizement and greed. Such a charge betrays ignorance of its history. The men who have labored most enduringly at the fabrics of empire were not getters of wealth and plunderers of spoil. It was due to their strength of character and moral purpose that British rule in India and Egypt has become the embodiment of order and justice. Duty is an abstract term, but the facts it signifies are the most concrete and real in our experience. The essential thing is to grasp its meaning as a motive power in men's lives. This was probably from Kerr, but could have been Toynbee or Milner speaking. The writer continued, "The end of the state is to make men, and its strength is measured not in terms of defensive armaments or economic prosperity but by the moral personality of its citizens. The function of the state is positive and ethical, to secure for its individual members that they shall not merely live but live well." Social reformers are prone to insist too strongly on an ideal of material comfort for the people. The life of satisfaction depends not on higher wages or lower prices or on leisure for recreation, but on work that calls into play the higher capacities of man's nature. The cry of the masses should be not for wages or comforts or even liberty, but for opportunities for enterprise and responsibility. The policy for closer union in the empire is full of significance in relation to this demand. There is but one way of promise. It is that the peoples of the empire shall realize their national unity and draw from that ideal an inspiration to common endeavor in the fulfillment of the moral obligations which their membership of the empire entails. The recognition of common imperial interests is bound to broaden both their basis of public action and their whole view of life. Public life is ennobled by great causes and by these alone. Political corruption, place hunting, and party intrigue have their natural home in small communities where attention is concentrated upon local interests. Great public causes call into being the intellectual and moral potentialities of people. The phrases national character, national will, and national personality are no empty catchwords. Everyone knows that esprit de corps is not a fiction but a reality, that the spirit animating a college or a regiment is something that cannot be measured in terms of the private contributions of the individual members. The people of the Empire are face to face with a unique and an historic opportunity. It is their mission to base the policy of a great empire on the foundations of freedom and law. It remains for them to crown the structure by the institution of a political union that shall give solidarity to the empire as a whole. Duty and the logic of facts alike point to this goal of their endeavor. In this article can be found, at least implicitly, all the basic ideas of the Milner Group, their suspicion of party politics, their emphasis on moral qualities and the cement of common outlook for linking people together, their conviction that the British Empire is the supreme moral achievement of man, but an achievement yet incomplete and still unfolding. Their idea that the highest moral goals are the development of personality through devotion to duty and service under freedom and law, their neglect, even scorn, for economic considerations, and their feeling for the urgent need to persuade others to accept their point of view in order to allow the empire to achieve the destiny for which they yearn. The Milner Group is a standing refutation of the Marxist or Leninist interpretations of history or of imperialism. Its members were motivated only slightly by materialistic incentives, and their imperialism was motivated not at all by the desire to preserve or extend capitalism. On the contrary, their economic ideology, in the early stages at least, was more socialistic than Manchester in its orientation. To be sure, it was an undemocratic kind of socialism, which was willing to make many sacrifices to the well-being of the masses of the people but reluctant to share with these masses political power that might allow them to seek their own well-being. This socialistic leaning was more evident in the earlier or Balliol period than in the later or New College period, and disappeared almost completely when Lothian and Brand replaced Esher, Gray, and Milner at the centre of the group. Esher regarded the destruction of the middle class as inevitable and felt that the future belonged to the workers and an administrative state. He dedicated his book After the War 1919 to Robert Smillie, president of the Miners' Federation, and wrote him a long letter on May 5, 1919. On September 12 of the same year, he wrote to his son, the present Viscount Esher, "There are things that cannot be confiscated by the Smitleys and Sidney Webbs. These seem to me the real objectives." Even earlier, Arnold Toynbee was a socialist of sorts and highly critical of the current ideology of liberal capitalism as proclaimed by the high priests of the Manchester School. Milner gave 6 lectures on socialism in Whitechapel in 1882, published in 1931 in the National Review. Both Toynbee and Milner worked intermittently at social service of a mildly socialistic kind, an effort that resulted in the founding of Toynbee Hall as a settlement house in 1884. As chairman of the Board of Internal Revenue in 1892 to 1897, Milner drew up Sir William Harcourt's budget, which inaugurated the inheritance tax. In South Africa he was never moved by capitalistic motives, placing a heavy profits tax on the output of the Rand mines to finance social improvements, and considering with objective calm the question of nationalizing the railroads or even the mines. Both Toynbee and Milner were early suspicious of the virtues of free trade, not, however, because tariffs could provide high profits for industrial concerns, but because tariffs and imperial preference could link the empire more closely into economic unity. In his later years, Milner became increasingly radical, a development that did not fit any too well with the conservative financial outlook of Brand, or even Hitchens. As revealed in his book Questions of the Hour 1923, Milner was a combination of technocrat and guild socialist and objected vigorously to the orthodox financial policy of deflation, balanced budget, gold standard, and free international exchange advocated by the group after 1918. This orthodox policy, inspired by Brand and accepted by the Round Table after 1918, was regarded by Milner as an invitation to depression, unemployment, and the dissipation of Britain's material and moral resources. On this point there can be no doubt that Milner was correct. Not himself a trained economist, Milner, nevertheless, saw that the real problems were of a technical and material nature, and that Britain's ability to produce goods should be limited only by the real supply of knowledge, labour, energy, and materials, and not by the artificial limitations of a deliberately restricted supply of money and credit. This point of view of Milner's was not accepted by the group until after 193-1, and not as completely as by Milner even then. The point of view of the group, at least in the period 1918 to 1931, was the point of view of the international bankers with whom Brand, Hitchens, and others were so closely connected. This point of view, which believed that Britain's pre-war financial supremacy could be restored merely by re-establishing the pre-war financial system, with the pound sterling at its pre-war parity, failed completely to see the changed conditions that made all efforts to restore the pre-war system impossible. The group's point of view is clearly revealed in the Round Table articles of the period. In the issue of December 1918, Brand advocated the financial policy which the British government followed, with such disastrous results, for the next 13 years. He wrote, "That nation will recover quickest after the war which corrects soonest any depreciation in currency, reduces by production and saving its inflated credit, brings down its level of prices, and restores the free import and export of gold." With all our wealth of financial knowledge and experience behind us, it should be easy for us to steer the right path, though it will not be always a pleasant one, amongst the dangers of the future. Every consideration leads to the view that the restoration of the gold standard, whether or not it can be achieved quickly, should be our aim. Only by that means can we be secure that our level of prices shall be as low as or lower than prices in other countries. and on that condition depends the recovery of our export trade and the prevention of excessive imports. Only by that means can we provide against and abolish the depreciation of our currency which, though the existing prohibition against dealings in gold prevents our measuring it, almost certainly exists, and safeguard ourselves against excessive grants of credit. He then outlined a detailed program to contract credit, curtail government spending, raise taxes, curtail imports, increase exports, etc. 15 Hitchens, who, as an industrialist rather than a banker, was not nearly so conservative in financial matters as Brand, suggested that the huge public debt of 1919 be met by a capital levy, but, when Brand's policies were adopted by the government, Hitchens went along with them and sought a way out for his own business by reducing costs by rationalization of production. These differences of opinion on economic matters within the group did not disrupt the group, because it was founded on political rather than economic ideas and its roots were to be found in ancient Athens rather than in modern Manchester. The Balliol generation, from Jowett and Nettleship, and the New College generation, from Zimmern, obtained an idealistic picture of classical Greece which left them nostalgic for the 5th century of Hellenism and drove them to seek to re-establish the ancient fellowship of intellect and patriotism in modern Britain. The funeral oration of Pericles became their political covenant with destiny. Duty to the state and loyalty to one's fellow citizens became the chief values of life. But, realizing that the jewel of Hellenism was destroyed by its inability to organize any political unit larger than a single city, the Milner Group saw the necessity of political organization in order to ensure the continued existence of freedom and higher ethical values, and hoped to be able to preserve the values of their day by organizing the whole world around the British Empire. Curtis puts this quite clearly in the Commonwealth of Nations 1916, where he says, "States, whether autocracies or commonwealths, ultimately rest on duty, not on self-interest or force. The quickening principle of a state is a sense of devotion, an adequate recognition somewhere in the minds of its subjects that their own interests are subordinate to those of the state. The bond which unites them and constitutes them collectively as a state is, to use the words of Lincoln, in the nature of dedication. Its validity, like that of the marriage tie, is at root not contractual but sacramental. Its foundation is not self-interest, but rather some sense of obligation, however conceived, which is strong enough to overmaster self-interest." 16. History for this group, and especially for Curtis, presented itself as an age-long struggle between the principles of autocracy and the principles of commonwealth, between the forces of darkness and the forces of light, between Asiatic theocracy and European freedom. This view of history, founded on the work of Zimmern, E. A. Freeman, Lord Bryce, and A. V. Dicey, felt that the distinguishing mark between the two hosts could be found in their views of law. The forces of light regarding law as man-made and mutable, but yet above all men, while the forces of darkness regarded law as divine and eternal, yet subordinate to the king. The one permitted diversity, growth, and freedom, while the other engendered monotony, stultification, and slavery. The struggle between the two had gone on for thousands of years, spawning such offspring as the Persian Wars, the Punic Wars, and the struggles of Britain with the forces of Philip II, of Louis XIV, of Napoleon, and of Wilhelm II. Thus, to this group, Britain stood as the defender of all that was fine or civilized in the modern world, just as Athens had stood for the same values in the ancient world. 17. Britain's mission, under this interpretation, was to carry freedom and light, that is, the principles of commonwealth, against the forces of theocracy and darkness, that is, autocracy in Asia, and even in Central Europe. For this group regarded the failure of France or Germany to utilize the English idea of supremacy of law as described by Dicey in his The Law of the Constitution, 1885, as proof that these countries were still immersed, at least partially, in the darkness of theocratic law. The slow spread of English political institutions to Europe as well as Asia in the period before the First World War was regarded by the group as proof both of their superiority and of the possibility of progress. In Asia and Africa, at least, England's civilizing mission was to be carried out by force, if necessary, for the function of force is to give moral ideas time to take root. Asia thus could be compelled to accept civilization, a procedure justifiable to the group on the grounds that Asians obviously better off under European rule than under the rule of fellow Asians and, if consulted, would clearly prefer British rule to that of any other European power. To be sure, the blessings to be extended to the less fortunate peoples of the world did not include democracy. To Milner, to Curtis, and apparently to most members of the group, democracy was not an unmixed good, or even a good, and far inferior to rule by the best, or, as Curtis says, by those who have some intellectual capacity for judging the public interest, and, what is no less important, some moral capacity for treating it as paramount to their own. This disdain for unrestricted democracy was quite in accordance with the ideas revealed by Milner's activities in South Africa and with the Greek ideals absorbed at Balliol or New College. However, the restrictions on democracy accepted by the Milner group were of a temporary character, based on the lack of education and background of those who were excluded from political participation. It was not a question of blood or birth, for these men were not racists. This last point is important because of the widespread misconception that these people were racially intolerant. They never were. Certainly those of the inner circle never were. On the contrary, they were ardent advocates of a policy of education and uplift of all groups, so that ultimately all groups could share in political life and in the rich benefits of the British way of life. To be sure, the members of the group did not advocate the immediate extension of democracy and self-government to all peoples within the empire, but these restrictions were based not on color of skin or birth but upon cultural outlook and educational background. Even Rhodes, who is widely regarded as a racist because his scholarships were restricted to candidates from the Nordic countries, was not the racist. He restricted his scholarships to these countries because he felt that they had a background sufficiently homogeneous to allow the hope that educational interchange could link them together to form the core of the worldwide system which he hoped would ultimately come into existence. Beyond this, Rhodes insisted that there must be no restrictions placed on the scholarships on a basis of race, religion, skin color, or national origin. In his own life, Rhodes cared nothing about these things. Some of his closest friends were Jews like Bite, and in 3 of his wills he left Lord Rothschild as his trustee, in one as his sole trustee. Milner and the other members felt similarly. Lionel Curtis, in his writings, makes perfectly clear both his conviction that character is acquired by training rather than innate ability and his insistence on tolerance in personal contact between members of different races. In his The Commonwealth of Nations 1916 he says, English success in planting North America and the comparative failure of their rivals must, in fact, be traced to the respective merits not of breed but of institutions, and again, the energy and intelligence which had saved Thelles in the Persian Wars was the product of her free institutions. In another word, he protests against English mistreatment of natives in India and states emphatically that it must be ended. He says, the conduct on the part of Europeans is more than anything else the root cause of Indian unrest. I am strongly of opinion that governors should be vested with powers to investigate judicially cases where Europeans are alleged to have outraged Indian feelings. Wherever a case of wanton and unprovoked insult such as those I have cited is proved, government should have the power to order the culprit to leave the country. A few deportations would soon effect a definite change for the better. 19 That Dove felt similarly is clear from his letters to Brand. Without a belief in racism, it was perfectly possible for this group to believe, as they did, in the ultimate extension of freedom and self-government to all parts of the empire. To be sure, they believed that this was a path to be followed slowly, but their reluctance was measured by the inability of backward peoples to understand the principles of a commonwealth, not by reluctance to extend to them either democracy or self-government. Curtis defined the distinction between a commonwealth and a despotism in the following terms. The rule of law as contrasted with the rule of an individual is the distinguishing mark of a commonwealth. In despotism, government rests on the authority of the ruler or of the invisible and uncontrollable power behind him. In a commonwealth, rulers derive their authority from the law and the law from a public opinion which is competent to change it. Accordingly, the institutions of a commonwealth cannot be successfully worked by peoples whose ideas are still those of a theocratic or patriarchal society. The premature extension of representative institutions throughout the empire would be the shortest road to anarchy. 20. The people must first be trained to understand and practice the chief principles of Commonwealth, namely the supremacy of law and the subjection of the motives of self-interest and material gain to the sense of duty to the interests of the community as a whole. Curtis felt that such an educational process was not only morally necessary on the part of Britain but was a practical necessity, since the British could not expect to keep 430 million persons in subjection forever but must rather hope to educate them up to a level where they could appreciate and cherish British ideals. In one book he says, "The idea that the principle of the Commonwealth implies universal suffrage betrays an ignorance of its real nature. That principle simply means that government rests on the duty of the citizens to each other, and is to be vested in those who are capable of setting public interest before their own." 21. In another word he says, "As sure as day follows the night, the time will come then the Dominions will have to assume the burden of the whole of their affairs. For men who are fit for it, self-government is a question not of privilege but rather of obligation. It is duty, not interest, which impels men to freedom, and duty, not interest, is the factor which turns the scale in human affairs." India is included in this evolutionary process, for Curtis wrote, "The despotic government might long have closed India to Western ideas. But a commonwealth is a living thing. It cannot suffer any part of itself to remain inert. To live it must move, and move in every limb. Under British rule Western ideas will continue to penetrate and disturb Oriental society, and whether the new spirit ends in anarchy or leads to the establishment of a higher order depends upon how far the millions of India can be raised to a fuller and more rational conception of the ultimate foundations upon which the duty of obedience to government rests." These ideas were not Curtis's own, although he was perhaps the most prolific, most eloquent, and most intense in his feelings. They were apparently shared by the whole inner circle of the group. Duff, writing to Brand from India in 1919, is favourable to reform and says, "Lionel is right. You can't dam the world current. There is, I am convinced, purpose under such things. All that we can do is to try to turn the flood into the best channel." In the same letter he said, "Unity will, in the end, have to be got in some other way. Love, call it, if you like, by a longer name, is the only thing that can make our post-war world go round, and it has, I believe, something to say here too. The future of the empire seems to me to depend on how far we are able to recognize this. Our trouble is that we start some way behind scratch. Indians must always find it hard to understand us." And the future Lord Lothian, ordering an article on India for the Round Table from a representative in India, wrote, "We want an article in the Round Table and I suggest to you that the main conclusion which the reader should draw from it should be that the responsibility rests upon him of seeing that the Indian demands are sympathetically handled without delay after the war. 22. What this group feared was that the British Empire would fail to profit from the lessons they had discerned in the Athenian Empire or in the American Revolution. Zimmern had pointed out to them the sharp contrast between the high idealism of Pericles' funeral oration and the crass tyranny of the Athenian Empire. They feared that the British Empire might fall into the same difficulty and destroy British idealism and British liberties by the tyranny necessary to hold on to a reluctant empire. And any effort to hold an empire by tyranny they regarded as doomed to failure. Britain would be destroyed, as Athens was destroyed, by powers more tyrannical than herself. And, still drawing parallels with ancient Greece, the group feared that all culture and civilization would go down to destruction because of our inability to construct some kind of political unit larger than the national state, just as Greek culture and civilization in the 4th century BC went down to destruction because of the Greeks' inability to construct some kind of political unit larger than the city-state. This was the fear that had animated Rhodes, and it was the same fear that was driving the Milner Group to transform the British Empire into a Commonwealth of Nations and then place that system within a League of Nations. In 1917, Curtis wrote in his letter to the people of India, "The world is in throes which precede creation or death. Our whole race has outgrown the merely national state, and as surely as day follows night or night the day will pass either to a commonwealth of nations or else an empire of slaves. And the issue of these agonies rests with us." At the same time, the example of the American Revolution showed the group the dangers of trying to rule the empire from London. To tax without representation could only lead to disruption. Yet it was no longer possible that 45 million in the United Kingdom could tax themselves for the defence of 435 million in the British Empire. What, then, was the solution? The Milner Group's efforts to answer this question led eventually, as we shall see in Chapter 8, to the present Commonwealth of Nations. But before we leave the Round Table, a few words should be said about Lord Milner's personal connection with the Round Table Group and the group's other connections in the field of journalism and publicity. Milner was the creator of the Round Table Group, since this is but another name for the kindergarten, and remained in close personal contact with it for the rest of his life. In the sketch of Milner in the Dictionary of National Biography, written by Basil Williams of the kindergarten, we read, "He was always ready to discuss national questions on a non-party basis, joining with former members of his South African kindergarten in their mood," from which originated the Political Review, the Round Table, and in a more heterogeneous society, the Coefficients, where he discussed social and imperial problems with such curiously assorted members as L. S. Amory, H. G. Wells, Lord Haldane, Sir Edward Grey, Sir Michael Sadler, Bernard Shaw, J. L. Garvin, William Amber Reeves, and W. A. S. Hewins. In the obituary of Hitchens, as already indicated, we find in reference to the Round Table the sentence, "Often at its head sat the old masters of the kindergarten, Lord Milner and his successor, Lord Selborne, close friends and allies of Hitchens to the end. And in the obituary of Lord Milner in the Round Table for June 1925, we find the following significant passage. The founders and the editors of the Round Table mourn in a very special sense the death of Lord Milner. For with him they have lost not only a much beloved friend, but one whom they have always regarded as their leader. Most of them had the great good fortune to serve under him in South Africa during or after the South African War, and to learn at first hand from him something of the great ideals which inspired him. From those days at the very beginning of this century right up to the present time, through the days of Crown Colony government in the Transvaal and Orange Free State, of the making of the South African Constitution, and through all the varied and momentous history of the British Empire. In the succeeding 15 years, they have had the advantage of Lord Milner's counsel and guidance, and they are grateful to think that, though at times he disagreed with them, he never ceased to regard himself as the leader to whom, above everyone else, they looked. It is of melancholy interest to recall that Lord Milner had undertaken to come on May 13, the very day of his death, to a meeting specially to discuss with them South African problems. The Round Table was published during the Second World War from Rhodes House, Oxford, which is but one more indication of the way in which the various instruments of the Milner Group are able to cooperate with one another. The Times and the Round Table are not the only publications which have been controlled by the Milner Group. At various times in the past, the group has been very influential on the staffs of the Quarterly Review, the 19th Century and After, The Economist, and The Spectator. Anyone familiar with these publications will realize that most of them, for most of the time, have been quite secretive as to the names of the members of their staffs or even as to the names of their editors. The extent of the Milner Group's influence and the periods during which it was active cannot be examined here. The Milner Group was also very influential in an editorial fashion in regard to a series of excellent and moderately priced volumes known as the Home University Library. Any glance at the complete list of volumes in this series will reveal that a large number of the names are those of persons mentioned in this study. The influence of the group on the Home University Library was chiefly exercised through H.A.L. Fisher, a member of the inner circle of the group, but the influence, apparently, has survived to his death in 1940. The Milner Group also attempted, at the beginning at least, to use Milner's old connections with adult education and working-class schools, a connection derived from Toynbee and Samuel Barnett, to propagate its imperial doctrines. As L. Smith, the master of Balliol, put it in 1915, "We must educate our masters." In this connection, several members of the Round Table Group played an active role in the Oxford Summer School for working-class students in 1913. This was so successful, especially a lecture on the Empire by Curtis, that a 2-week conference was held early in the summer of 1914, addressed by members of the Round Table Group, and others, on imperial and foreign problems, to quote A. L. Smith again. As a result, the plan was drawn up on July 30, 1914 to present similar programs in the 110 tutorial classes existing in industrial centers. The outbreak of war prevented most of this program from being carried out. After the war ended, the propaganda work among the British working classes became less important, for various reasons, of which the chief were that working class ears were increasingly monopolized by Labour Party speakers and that the Round Table Group were busy with other problems like the League of Nations, Ireland, and the United States. 23